Thank you. It's such an honor to be here. That's a hard introduction to follow there, right? But thank you so much. I love the idea that I might be the master or mistress of anything. It's great. I'm going to carry that with me. I did not call myself the master of fairy tales, so a critic did, and it sort of followed me around now, haunting me a little bit. But I love what you just said about that. Thank you for hosting me here on this fairy tale campus, and thanks to Steve and Colleen for putting together such a great visit with a wonderful lunchtime conversation with some MFA students. I learned so much about what you're reading, writing, and thinking about here. It's just great to see such a turnout. So how's the sound back there? Sound is good? Thanks. So I love that you started the evening with a little call and return, and everyone knew the right answer, right? Just right. Everyone knew what to say. And likewise, I think of fairy tales as a kind of language that we know before we know language. But once we know language, it's hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't know fairy tales. If I say just 3 words, girl, woods, wolf, what's the story? Just about everyone knows, whether they're encountering that story here or somewhere where the wolf is depicted as a bear, a dog, a pig, or a snotty-nosed goat, as in some versions. These stories are like a language themselves, and I was drawn to them for their poetics, not so much as princess gets married stories, but as stories of survival above all. Stories where the characters are willing to chop off their toes in order to distinguish themselves, but they don't win, actually. They're quite punished severely at the end for being terrible people, those 2 ladies of whom you spoke. But the radical means that their characters go to survive. So even though Disney gets a bad rap, if you've seen Snow White, the movie, their first full-length animated fairy tale movie, she's a girl who escapes the murderous impulses of a near relative who wants her heart and her liver, who wants her dead. She runs alone into the woods. And a couple hundred years prior, the first known literary version of Little Red Riding Hood ends very much in the same way, with the girl, who's in that case nameless, emerging from the bed of the wolf. She's not eaten, she's merely naked. And about to be eaten, she runs through the woods. And I was really drawn to these radical means that the characters were willing to go to escape pretty horrific domestic experiences of abuse, of just about any variety under the sun. And I loved their language. So I'm just going to read you a couple of my stories. It's hard to call them my stories because they have lineage back thousands of years. I'm going to read you a story from the collection How a Mother Weaned Her Girl from Fairy Tales, and then a newer story from a few months ago. How a Mother Weaned Her Girl from Fairy Tales is, I would say, an imitation, to borrow Angela Carter's term, of a German story that's most often translated with the title, How a Husband Weaned His Wife from Fairy Tales. And that's a story about a woman who wants to hear fairy tales around the clock. Her husband is, he's exasperated by this. There's some suggestion that possibly she's sleeping around. He doesn't like that either. So he beats her, and she never asks for another fairy tale again. And she's quite compliant. It's a nice little story, good for bedtime. How it was excised from the Grimm's collection when it started to work its way into children's bedrooms, of course. How a Mother Weaned Her Girl from Fairy Tales is, I guess you could say, my take on that story. But it's also about abusive love, I suppose you could say. There was once a mother whose only child loved fairy tales above all else and accepted as dolls only those that told stories. Of course, the child suffered as a result, for there were not many dolls that could perform such a task. Her mother suffered as well. When she went to the department store on birthdays or Christmas, She often left empty-handed, destined to disappoint her only child, who asked for more and more stories over the years. The child never said she was disappointed. She only said she wanted more fairy tales. That's all she ever wanted, she said. The ones with the goriest endings. Find the dolls that can tell those, won't you please? By her 15th birthday, the girl had precisely 2 dolls. One that told wonderful stories and one that told very bad stories. The girl was very good-natured. She told her mother, one cold winter evening, that even 2 dolls, one that could tell wonderful stories and one that could tell terrible stories, were better than no dolls, and that their household had more fairy tales than many far more impoverished homes where perhaps no storytelling dolls ever had lived. And then she hugged her mother and kissed her goodnight. That very same night, at a late hour, and after some vodka, the mother suddenly wondered for the first time how she might wean her daughter from fairy tales. There was a knock on the door. There stood a shivering doll, probably a witch, for she was life-sized, and she asked the mother for shelter. The girl's mother said, "Can you tell stories?" "My daughter does not allow any dolls in the house that cannot tell stories." The doll saw that she had no choice. She was a rag doll, and she'd gotten wet. She had icicles dangling off her yarn hair. Her large fingers nearly were frozen, like links of meat one might keep in the freezer. "I can. And will you tell them for a long time?" "All night." They agreed on some terms. The mother let the doll in and set her in a rocking chair by the fire, where her cotton stuffing nicely and evenly warmed, but not too much. The mother gently woke up her daughter and said, "There is a doll here that has promised to tell stories all night on the condition that your other dolls do not argue or interrupt." The daughter woke up her dolls, the one that could tell good stories and the one that could tell bad stories, and brought them to the living room and sat near the hearth. The mother had laid out treats for them all. Lollipops with chocolate centers and then miniature globes, jelly beans, toast. The thawed doll spoke. "Yes, I will tell stories, but there must be no interruptions or I will tell no more stories to you." The mother, the daughter, and the 2 dolls ate their snacks and went back to their beds. The doll began. "An owl flew by a garden, sat on a tree trunk, and drank some water." An owl flew by a garden, sat on a tree trunk, and drank some water. An owl flew by a garden, sat on a tree trunk, and drank some water. An owl flew by a garden, sat on a tree trunk, and drank some water. Over and over the doll repeated this sentence. The good doll listened and said from her little doll bed, "That's a beautiful story, but I'm afraid your audience might become tired of it." "I'm not tired of it, of course. I think it's a lovely story, but..." And then the bad doll shouted from her bed, "That's not even a story." The big doll gazed coldly into the fire. "Doll 1, you've interrupted me. There were to be no interruptions in doll 2. You have interrupted and you have argued. That was only the beginning of the story. I was going to change it later. I was only just starting out." She stared at the fire. Her expression hardened, which was difficult, as her whole head was made of a large walnut shell. And then the hardness turned into sadness. The big doll stood, and she sighed, and she picked up the 2 littler dolls from their beds. "I will take these with me and teach them how to behave." Then she flew out of the window. The mother rushed to the daughter, who'd been blissfully sleeping, dreaming the whole thing, just like a character might in an old storybook. A frozen rag doll, walnut-headed and big, played the lead role in the dream, as if she were an old illustration drawn hovering above the girl's very head while she was sleeping. The mother knelt down, clasped the daughter's warm hands in her own, and said, "The dolls were told not to interrupt and never to argue, and now look what's happened. They're both gone. You won't get any more fairy tales. They're trouble. I tell you, they're trouble." The girl vowed never to ask for a talking doll again. Though smiling, she seemed very unhappy. The mother paced around the house for hours each day. "If only you'd followed her rules. We could have seated the dolls in their miniature high chairs, taped over their little doll mouths, and listened to her fairy tales. Then we'd still have the dolls. We'd still have fairy tales. We should have let her finish her story. It wasn't a very good story, but it was only beginning." The daughter tried to comfort the mother. "At least we still have each other. Maybe she was just lonely. Maybe she needed some friends. It was worse for her. It was worse for her. She didn't know how to tell a good story." The daughter looked out the window at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of the dolls. It was something to hope for anyway, that she might someday see them floating around in the dark sky, the big doll repeating her story over and over again, while one small doll gently admonished, and the other berated the tale. An owl flew by a garden, sat on a tree trunk, and drank some water. An owl flew by a garden, sat on a tree trunk, and drank some water. An owl flew by a garden, sat on a tree trunk, and drank some water. Oh. So this is a story, I guess these are both actually tonight. I don't know how much time I have, but I've got stories from around the world, but this is also a story based on a German tale, although I work from tales all over the place. This story is based on another story you may not know that didn't make it to Disney. It's called The Hare's Bride. Do you know that story? It's about a girl who's forced into marriage, basically, with a rabbit. And things don't go very well from there. Nobody gets out of that story alive. So this story I wrote it a few months ago when I was quite obsessively watching again a documentary about David Bowie in his early years. And he was a great shapeshifter, a great fairy tale artist, I think. And he said something really interesting that rung true to me about his work in music. And he said, I don't consider myself to be a rock and roller. I'm paraphrasing here. He said it in much more beautiful accents as well. I don't consider myself to be a rock and roller. I consider myself to be an artist, and rock and roll is my art form. And I really liked the way he said that he was putting on the disguise of a rock and roller and taking on all these different forms of music in his career in a really amazing and beautiful way, and in his own way infiltrating then the culture that he was also a critic of, and as a child of poverty left out of oftentimes. That was his. I loved that, though. I'm not a rock and roller. I'm an artist, and rock and roll is my art form. So I was writing this story when I was watching this documentary over and over again, and so there are some things in it about punk music, but the musicians don't come across very well, and I apologize to all my friends who are musicians and all the punk bands that have influenced me over the years. So everyone's a villain in all of these stories. The Punk's Bride. And this is the first story I've written in 25 years that has swear words in it, but I'm gonna kind of like bleep them out. So, I don't know why. Modesty. All right. There was once a woman and her daughter, and the daughter kept a beautiful garden with cabbages, daisies, etc. The daughter was in her early 20s and lived at home. She was a secretary and couldn't afford her own place, and she didn't want to move in with some friends who had asked her. Their apartment always was dirty, and there were different guys over most nights. The daughter wasn't a prude, but she got nervous about the idea she wouldn't know who was there when she was sleeping. The mother also was nervous and didn't like her daughter to go out at night, but sometimes the girl went out to the bar. It was on the same block as their little house. Actually, it was next door. It used to be a convenience store, but had been turned into a bar. When the daughter went to the bar and sat on the back patio to smoke, her mother sat on their back patio too. They had conversations through the chain link fence. One bar regular was an attractive guy in a punk band. It was a good band, and he wore tiny hoop earrings. One night, after hours, he leaned over their fence and picked at the daisies. The mother said to her daughter, "Can you go out front and ask that punk to move on? He's frightening me." The girl stood behind the screen door of her house and said, "My mother wants you to leave." It was 3 o'clock in the morning. The mother and daughter were light sleepers and usually dozed in the front room on the couch instead of going to bed. They left the TV on all night, playing Mexican soap operas. The guy said, "Come hear my band play. We're playing at EJ's tomorrow. It's across from Bar 22. I'll put you on the list." At Bar 22, the lights were always too bright. They had red velvet booths and dollar whiskey cokes. It wasn't a cool bar, so the girl liked it there. but she didn't go hear the punk's band. The next night, he showed up again around the same time and started to sing to the flowers a song about life on Mars. The woman said to her daughter, "Please, I'm begging you, just get him to leave." The girl went out beyond the screen door. "I don't know what's her problem," she said. She wore a pair of men's underwear and a black t-shirt with a white unicorn on it. The musician said, "Just get on the back of my bike and we'll go to my house and listen to records." He gestured toward his 3-speed. It was white and rusted and had a kickstand. It had a Gordon Lightfoot bumper sticker on it, and one of the tires was flat. She shook her head shyly, went back inside. On the third day, the guy leaned over the gate and held his hands clasped together like he was praying. "Jean," the mother said, "Jean." Jean went outdoors and said, "Can you, pick another garden to hunt? We just happen to live next to the bar. It isn't my fault. Jean, I've known you for years. Come over. It's not a big deal." So she went, and they listened to records. They got really drunk on tequila, the kind that comes in a glass skull. The next day, she made him breakfast, then lunch, then supper. After a few years like this, he said they should get married. Who were the wedding guests? I can tell you this because someone told me. They were all musicians, except for the house painters, and they were all friends of the husbands, except for the one who was head secretary at Jean's place of employment. She lived on a houseboat with her husband, who also was there. They were both very small. A bartender from the bar that was next door to her mother's house served as the minister, and the altar was a hydrangea in the front yard. The wedding party went into the wee hours, which Jean used to enjoy with her mother in front of the television, but now spent by herself while her boyfriend was out at the bars. She used to love to fall asleep under a blanket with her mother on the brown sofa. Now she stayed up alone. Later on that night, the husband was in the backyard with some wedding guests and others who'd heard that there was a party. He smoked a cigarette. He smoked 20 cigarettes. He smoked some more cigarettes. Then he yelled through the screen to the kitchen, "Jean, get the F out here. Everyone thinks you're being crazy. Act like you love me." Maybe he saw her crying in the kitchen, or maybe he didn't. Her husband went back to the party. At one point, another musician came in and kissed Jean, and she forgot her troubles for a few moments. But soon he pushed her away and leaned on the counter and threw up in the sink. Then it got lighter outside, and her husband came to the kitchen screen and said, "Jean, dude, make us some breakfast. We're starving. And you're such a great cook." When she didn't answer, he started yelling, "F you, Jean, F you. You aren't any fun. You never were fun. You ruined my life, you effing bitch." Oh, that was sort of... Forgot that one. After a while, the yelling stopped, and it was pretty much silent. The party had moved somewhere else. Jean didn't know what to do. But eventually, she went into the bedroom and found a doll she'd bought at a thrift shop. Not her usual thing, buying stuff that she didn't need for decorative or emotional reasons. Yet she liked the doll. It was nondescript, made of straw. Seemed like it needed a friend. She dressed the straw doll in her clothes, gave it a stirring spoon, and stood it next to the stove in the kitchen. Then she went home to her mother. She was 47 years old. Her husband came back that evening and yelled, "Open the GD door, Jean." Then he opened the door by kicking it in, even though it was unlocked, and he struck the doll hard on the head. That's when he realized it wasn't his bride. Actually, the girl hadn't gone back to her mother, and there wasn't any straw doll. That was from a great little story Jean never even had read. A story about rabbits. Can you believe that? The end. One more? You guys have another one? I guess I shouldn't put those words in my stories if I'm not going to read them out loud, right? Except that, I don't know if you guys have read the journal of Sylvia Plath. She always just typed out effing as F-ing, so I like to do that too. So yeah, that's my way of saying a swear word. It's so prudish, isn't it? And if you look at the old fairy tales, and I'm talking, from a couple thousand years ago to a couple hundred years ago, they're pretty not prude-ish at all. In fact, they really weren't intended for children in any way. It's only as children began to get their own bedrooms and thus need to be lulled into sleep by their tired, industrialized parents, did fairy tales start to make their way into the bedroom. But they were such unlikely candidates. There's nothing too soporific, is there, about cannibalism, incest, child abandonment, rape, wife beating, ne'er-do-wellism. Well, maybe there's something soporific about ne'er-do-wellism. But they were such unlikely candidates for the nursery, but they did find safe harbor there, interestingly, and it's thanks to some of the most so-called sanitized versions that were marketed and produced, lavishly illustrated and animated for children since the Grimm's final edition came out around 150 years ago, their final edition. It's thanks to their safe harbor there with librarians, with especially mothers and educators and the editors of children's books that we still have them today in large part, I think. I don't think they were ever at risk of going away, but I don't know, they had a nice safe haven in a very unlikely place, which is sort of beautiful. They're in an inappropriate place, which is sort of appropriate. All right, what am I going to read to you? I will read you a story called Pink Horse Tale. If it's in this book, yes it is. And I wrote this story for a project called Significant Objects, where authors were asked to write stories for little objects that were then marketed on eBay with the story. They were sold on eBay with the stories. And the editors who were, they were writers about they were economists, basically. One's an editor and one's an economist. They were trying to study which stories sold most on eBay, whether it was like if the object was cute, or if the author was well known, or if the object was useful, or if the story was happy. And they did this really great pie chart about which stories sold well. But I was sent this very strange, glass, muscular, pink, horse to write about. And this is the story I wrote based on a tale that you find around the world about a stubborn child that is a child who won't, well, it's a combination of two stories, but a child who won't stay in a grave, and also a child who's visited possibly by a magical agent and then perishes. So I just gave away the ending, sorry. Pink Horse Tale, and it's sold for $140, so that's pretty good. A long time ago, I was very poor and often traded my body for cigarettes, chelada, or food. These are listed in order of preference. I have 2 children, both daughters, and together we lived in a motel on the coast. It was a knotty pine kitchenette cabin, and it had come furnished with a teapot, a few chipped flowered plates, some utensils, and bedding. The cabin overlooked a paved parking lot, and beyond it, the beach. If a man came to visit, I sent my youngest girl out to find driftwood and starfish and shells. Her sister went to elementary school, so often was gone. There was no market for these trinkets among the occasional tourists, but they were precious to my young girls, truly their only possessions. We carefully washed them and kept them along the edge of the porch rail outside and on the white windowsills inside, which otherwise were totally bare, apart from a pink horse my youngest had found in the woods. That pink horse. How she loved it. Once when she'd gone a long way to gather her treasures, all the way through a natural tunnel that had grown in the cliff, which led to a narrow beach that would trap you and kill you if you were stuck there during high tide, an old woman with pink hair approached her and sang her a song. My daughter told me about this old woman. I almost didn't believe her. Later that week, the girl brought home a sea urchin, closed. She said that when the sea urchin opened, the old woman would return, and on top of that, the old woman had promised to bring us good luck at that time. I got an empty jar from the cupboard, a nice jar that had once been full of beach plum jelly but had long been gathering dust. My daughter and I walked down to the edge of the ocean and filled the jar with salt water. Back home, we placed the closed sea urchin carefully inside that jar. It quickly sunk and stayed closed. The next morning, my littlest girl didn't wake up. The sea urchin had bloomed. It was on her grave that my other daughter placed the pink horse, and then she too was taken by the high tide the very same week. She'd gone into the magic tunnel at a very bad time. Of course now, I do nothing but drink chelada all day, haunted by pink. Pink urchins, pink cigarettes, pink horse, pink horse. Pink horse on the grave. If ever the pink horse flies into the sky, your daughters will come back to life. The pink-haired old woman sang that to me once when I was passed out in the sand. For now, there you stand in the dark of the wood, beautiful, all-powerful, silent. Pink horse, you're everything, and everything is everlasting in you. I think I'll stop there.